when the ground froze so hard that the cemetery spade broke in two, Sarah Vance did not stop digging. She simply picked up her late husband's heavy logging axe and began chopping her way into the frozen clay, not to bury another loved one, but to plant what her neighbors called a monument of twigs. The wind across the plant wind, Dakota Territory in late October of 1887, was not just cold, it was a physical presence, a living beast that scoured the treeless prairie with a relentless, biting fury. It carried a sharp, metallic tang from the far north, a scent of ancient glaciers and endless gray skies that promised deep snow and even deeper isolation. On this flat, featureless horizon, there was nowhere to hide, no hill to break the wind's momentum, and no forest to offer sanctuary. For Sarah, standing alone in her wool skirt, the upcoming winter was not merely a seasonal shift. It was a looming predator. She knew the rule of the plains. Winter did not negotiate, and it did not show mercy. If you are watching this from somewhere cold right now, or if you have ever huddled under blankets while a winter storm rattled your windows, you are about to discover a forgotten frontier secret that kept one family safe when everything else failed. But before we reveal the physics behind this incredible survival strategy, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. We read every single comment, and we love learning about the cold weather challenges our viewers face all over the world. Because what Sarah was building out here on the windswept prairie was not just a collection of young trees. It was a highly organized shield designed to turn the natural elements against themselves. The cabin behind her was a modest, rugged structure built of lodgepole pine logs, topped with a heavy before his passing. By the standards of the Dakota frontier, it was a respectable home, but Sarah knew its secrets. She knew that when the temperature dropped below zero, the wind would find every microscopic seam in the chinking, turning their small living space into a drafty icebox. Her children, Billy, Lucy, were too young to understand the danger of a long winter, but they understood the cold. They knew what it was like to wake up with frost on their blankets. And they knew the biting ache of fingers that couldn't quite get warm, even next to the stove. Standing there with her hands caked in dry prairie dirt, Sarah looked at her children, who were gathering dried grass nearby, and felt the heavy weight of her responsibility. She was all they had left. The flat, empty plain stretched out around them for miles, an indifferent sea of brown grass that seemed to swallow up their tiny homestead. The neighbors, scattered far and wide across the territory, had already finished their winter preparations. They had banked sod high against their cabin foundations, stuffed extra mud and straw into the log gaps, and laid in massive piles of cordwood. They looked at the winter as an inevitable siege, a period of cold and endurance that had to be met with stubborn, unyielding resistance. But Sarah had spent the previous winter watching that resistance fail. She had seen how the wind stripped the heat directly from the log walls, how the draft on the floor could freeze a bucket of water solid overnight, and how her children shivered despite the roaring fire. She knew she couldn't survive another winter of simply burning wood faster. She needed a way to change the very air around them, and she believed she had found the answer in the bundles of young trees waiting in her yard. The grief of losing James was still a fresh, throbbing ache in Sarah's chest, a shadow that followed her through the daily rhythm of her chores. He had been a man of immense physical strength, a builder who believed that any obstacle on WTA, the frontier, could be overcome with sheer, unyielding labor. But that strength had not been enough to save him when a massive lodgepole pine rolled off a Crodian Brilliant timber sled in the high country, crushing him instantly and leaving Sarah to face the vast, indifferent Dakota plains alone. James had built their cabin with the confidence of a man who believed a thick wall was enough to keep out the cold, but Sarah's first winter on the claim had taught her the brutal truth of the plains. A single wall was a reactive defense. It simply sat there, absorbing the wind's anger and bleeding heat as fast as the fireplace could produce it. Her father, a quiet and observant forester from the deep hemlock woods of Maine, had taught her to see the world differently. He had been a man who spoke of trees as living communities, entities that survived not by resisting the elements, but by adapting to them. Sarah remembered walking with him through the 40s. Dense pine stands on bitter January mornings when she was no larger than Lucy. Outside the forest, the gale was a screaming monster, tearing across the frozen hills and stinging their faces with icy needles of snow. But the moment they stepped beneath the canopy of balsam fir and hemlock, the world became quiet. The wind vanished, replaced by a profound, muffled silence where the only sound was the soft hiss of snow settling on the boughs far above. In that sheltered pocket, the air felt warm, almost thick with life. Her father had pointed to the shallow, powdery snow on the forest floor, contrasting it with the massive, impassable drifts forming on the open hillsides. He explained that a solid wall was a brute's defense. It fought the frayne of frayne halfring nant, wind, and forced the snow to pile up exactly where it wasn't wanted. But a forest was a filter. Its millions of needles and branches broke the wind into countless, harmless currents, robbing the air of its momentum and forcing it to drop its burden of snow before it could reach the interior sanctuary. Standing on the 20s barren Dakota prairie, Sarah realized that if she wanted her children to survive, she had to recreate that Maine forest pocket right here, using the very elements of the storm to build a fortress of still air. She remembered how her father would analyze the different types of trees, explaining how their branches and needles worked together to manage the flow of the wind. He would point out the dense foliage of the young spruce trees, showing her how they grew low to the ground to prevent the wind from scouring beneath the canopy. He would contrast them with the tall, flexible pines that bent with the gale, absorbing its energy without breaking. It was a complex, beautiful choreography of survival, and Sarah had watched it work year after year. Now, as she stood on her treeless claim, surrounded by nothing but flat, wind-swept earth, she realized that the traditional cabins her neighbors built were fundamentally flawed. They were trying to block the wind with static, rigid walls, when they should be using the living architecture of the trees to redirect and disarm it. She knew her plan would require immense effort, but she also knew that James's traditional brute force methods had nearly frozen them to death. The blueprint for her defense was sketched on a piece of scrap paper by the light of a single tallow candle. It was an orderly, concentric pattern of staggered rings that she had designed based on her father's forest lessons. But translating that design into reality on the treeless prairie required a level of physical labor that would have broken a lesser spirit. The nearest source of living wood was Cottonwood Creek, a winding ribbon of water that cut through a creep, shallow ravine 2 miles to the north. In that protected drainage, young black, hill spruce and ponderosa pine grew in dense thickets, their branches green and resilient against the clay soil. Every morning, before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, Sarah would push her heavy wooden handcart across the empty miles. The iron-rimmed wheels of the Tapsavand cart groaned over the hard-packed earth, a lonely sound that carried far across the silence of the plains. When she reached the creek, she would seek out the strongest, healthiest saplings, looking for young trees with thick, central leaders and dense, healthy branching. She dug around each root ball with care, preserving as much of the native soil as possible, and wrapped them tightly in burlap sacks to protect them from the drying wind. The journey back was a grueling test of endurance. The cart, laden with soil, water, and the heavy saplings, pulled against her arms with a dead, exhausting weight. Her back ached with a dull, constant heat, and her hands, caked in dirt, were a map of fresh blisters and healing cuts. But as she wheeled each load into Her yard, she felt a quiet, fierce sense of progress. She was not just planting trees, she was importing a shield, importing the very architecture of survival, one heavy cartload at a time. By early November, her yard looked like a strange, miniature nursery, with nearly 100 saplings waiting in their burlap wraps for their permanent places in the earth. Each tree was carefully selected to play a specific role in her living wall. The ponderosa pines, with their long, flexible needles and deep taproots, were chosen to form the outer perimeter, where they would bear the initial brunt of to the wind. The Black Hills spruce, with their dense, low-growing branches, were designated for the inner ring, where they would act as the final, absolute filter to still the air. Sarah spent hours arranging the root balls in her yard, matching their sizes and shapes to the concentric diagram she had drawn. The children helped her keep the burlap moist, carrying small cups of water from the well to ensure the fragile roots didn't dry out before they could be planted. It was a race against the calendar, a desperate scramble to get the roots into the grained earth before the frost turned the clay into concrete. The construction of Sarah's living wall did not go unnoticed, though the Comberwas' reaction of her neighbors was far from supportive. Silas Thorne, a prosperous farmer whose claim lay 3 miles to the east, stopped his wagon on the trail one afternoon to watch her work. Silas was a man of traditional views, his face etched with the hard lines of a life spent forcing the earth to submit to his plow. Beside him sat his wife Abigail, whose expression of performative sympathy was more cutting than any open insult. Silas watched for a long moment as Sarah labored on her knees, tamping the dark loam around the roots of a young spruce. He shook his head, a gesture of weary, paternal judgment, before calling out to her. His voice, thick and heavy, carried easily on the cold autumn breeze. He asked her what she hoped to accomplish with such a foolish project, warning her that when the real winter storms arrived, those tiny twigs would do nothing to stop the wind. Instead, he argued they would act as a trap, catching the drifting snow and piling it directly against her cabin walls until she and her children were buried alive, sealed in their home until the spring thaw. Abigail offered a soft, pitying sigh, murmuring that Sarah should be inside, splitting wood or preparing stores of food rather than wasting her dwindling strength on gardening. To them, Sarah's planting was not a survival strategy, but a symptom of a mind unsettled by grief, a tragic deviation from the settled, established, hard-won rituals of frontier life. Sarah rose slowly, her joints aching from the damp earth, and offered them a tired, polite smile. She knew it was useless to argue with Silas. He saw only a wall of twigs, while she, through her father's eyes, saw the subtle, invisible mechanics of still air. She simply told him that she was not trying to stop the wind, but to lift it and to make the snow fall exactly where she wanted it to. Silas merely grunted, clucked his reins, and drove his wagon onward, leaving her alone in the quiet dust. The interaction was typical of the skepticism she faced from the few families in the valley. To them, the frontier was a place of black and white certainties. You built thick, square walls, you kept a roaring fire, and you endured the cold through sheer grit. Any attempt to innovate, to use a more structured and thoughtful approach, was viewed as a waste of time. They believed that because they had survived a few winters, their traditional reactive methods were the only way to live. But Sarah had seen the limitations of their way. She had seen neighbors lose fingers to frostbite, watched families burn through their entire winter's woodpile by February, and heard the wet, rattling coughs of children who spent their nights shivering in drafty bedrooms. She was determined to prove that there was a smarter way to live on the plains, a way that didn't require her children to suffer. Sarah's design was based on an aerodynamic truth that Silas Thorne's brute force methods could never comprehend. A solid barrier, like the slat windbreak James had once built, was a static defense. When the wind hit a solid wall, it did not stop. It compressed, accelerated, and roared over the top, creating a massive, low-pressure eddy on the downwind side. This vacuum sucked the wind back down, bringing the snow with it and dumping a massive, crushing drift directly against the very structure it was meant to protect. It was a self-defeating design, a wall that invited its own burial, but a living screen of evergreen needles acted as a sieve. By creating a double ring of staggered trees with an optical density of roughly 50%, Sarah was creating a permeable barrier. As the wind struck the outer ring of ponderosa pines, the air was not blocked, it was filtered. The branches broke the solid, pounding force of the gale into thousands of tiny, harmless currents. This process stripped the wind of its energy, reducing its velocity by up to 80% within the calm zone behind the trees. The physical consequences of this speed reduction were extraordinary. Wind speed directly dictates convective heat loss. When the wind velocity on an exterior wall is reduced from 40 miles per hour to just 8, the convective cooling effect on the lodgepole pine logs drops by roughly 85%. The cabin's logs would no longer act as a thermal drain, bleeding heat into the passing air. Instead, the air immediately surrounding the cabin would remain relatively still, acting as a thick, natural insulation blanket. Sarah knew that, if she could keep the air still, she could keep her family warm with a fraction of the wood they had burned the previous winter. This drop in convective cooling was the core of her strategy. In a standard cabin, the wind acted like a giant sponge, constantly absorbing the heat from the log walls and carrying it away into the open prairie. No matter how large a prairie fire James had built, the wind had always been faster, stripping the thermal energy from the wood before it could warm the interior air. But by stopping the wind before it ever reached the cabin, Sarah was creating a protective envelope of still, insulated air. The warmth from her stove would stay inside the log walls, radiating back into the living space instead of escaping. It was an elegant, passive design that relied on the natural geometry of the trees, rather than the continuous consumption of fuel. The physical execution of this plan required an organized, orderly effort from Sarah and her children. The prairie clay was hard as stone, a dense barrier that resisted the spade with a stubborn weight. To ensure the survival of her transplanted evergreens, Sarah had to prepare each hole with meticulous care. She dug down 2 feet, loosening the compacted earth, and mixed in buckets of rich, dark loam and river sand she had hauled from the creek bed to provide proper drainage and nutrients for the young roots. Billy and Lucy became her constant companions in this labor. Billy, with his small wooden spade, would help dig the shallow trenches, his face serious with the importance of his task. Lucy would carry small buckets of water from the cantass, her tiny boots leaving a trail of wet prints in the dry dust. Together, they would position each sapling in its designated spot within the concentric pattern. Sarah would hold the tree straight, her fingers gently spreading the 2 roots, while the children filled the hole with the prepared soil, patting it down with their hands to eliminate air pockets. This shared effort was more than just physical labor. It was an emotional anchor for the family. It gave the children a sense of purpose, a feeling that they were active participants in their own survival. As they worked, Sarah would tell them stories of the Maine woods, of her father, and of the quiet, patient way the forest lived through the winter. The children listened, their eyes wide and dull. In those quiet afternoons, the memory of James felt less like an open wound and more like a quiet strength supporting them. By the middle of November, as the November first hard freeze locked the Dakota soil, the last of the 98 trees was firmly in the ground, a silent green circle wrapping the cabin in a unified, living defense. The final row of ponderosa pines stood 15 feet from the cabin walls, their branches already beginning to touch, forming a continuous barrier of green. The inner ring of spruce, set just 10 feet in, provided a secondary layer of defense, their low-growing branches packed tight to block any wind that managed to slip through the outer ring. Standing in the center of the clearing, Sarah could feel the difference already. The wind, which had once scoured the yard with a relentless force, felt muted, its edge taken off by the young trees. It was a modest beginning, but it was a solid foundation for the winter ahead. With the arrival of late November, the green circle around the cabin was complete. The young evergreens stood in their quiet, orderly ranks, their branches dusted with the first light snow of the season. To the casual observer, they still looked fragile, a thin, pathetic barrier against the vastness of the Dakota plains. But to Martha Finch, an older widow who lived 2 miles to the plains west, the structure was a revelation. Martha was a woman of practical mind, her face lined with the experience of 20 winters on the plains. She had lost her husband to the cold years before, and she knew the price of ignorance on the frontier. She rode over to Sarah's claim one afternoon, her horse's hooves crunching softly on the frozen ground, and stood for a long moment studying the concentric pattern of the trees. Unlike Silas, Martha did not offer pity or judgment. She walked the perimeter, running, her gloved hand along the branches of a young spruce, her head cocked in deep thought. When Sarah emerged from the cabin, Martha looked at her with a quiet, respectful intensity. She asked Sarah to explain the pattern, and as Sarah described her father's lessons on aerodynamic lifting and the preservation of still air, Martha's eyes lit with understanding. She saw the logic immediately, the way the outer ring would trip the wind, the way the inner ring would filter the air, and the way the quiet zone between the trees and the cabin would trap warmth. It was the first time anyone in the valley had looked at Sarah's work with respect, and the quiet validation felt like a warm hearth in the gathering cold. Martha's support was a turning point for Sarah. On the isolated frontier, the weight of public skepticism could be as exhausting as the physical labor, and having one person who understood her design was a profound comfort. Martha stayed for tea, and they sat by the window, watching the young evergreens sway gently in the breeze. Martha noted how the wind seemed to lift as it approached the outer ring of pines, passing over the cabin's sod roof instead of slamming directly into the logs. It was a subtle, beautiful proof of Sarah's design, and as Martha rode back to her own claim that evening, Sarah felt a quiet, renewed sense of confidence. She was ready for whatever the winter had in store. January of 1888 arrived with a stillness that felt ominous. The wind, which had been a constant, howling presence for weeks, suddenly died, leaving the plains in an unnatural silence. The sky took on a heavy, luminous greenish-gray cast, a color that veteran plainsmen recognized as the signature of a catastrophic storm. The air was cold, a dry, static chill that made the skin on Sarah's face feel tight and brittle. She knew the silence was a warning. She made her final preparations with an organized, quiet focus. She brought in the last of the seasoned wood, stacking the logs high against the cabin wall. She filled her water barrels from the well, the iron handle of the pump burning her skin even through her heavy blank gloves. She checked on their milk cow in the small lean-to, ensuring the door was secured with a heavy wooden bar, and adding extra hay to keep the animal's metabolic warmth high through the coming freeze. By afternoon, the first flakes began to fall, small, hard crystals that drifted vertically in the still air. Sarah gathered Billy and Lucy inside, closing the heavy wooden door and sliding the bar into place. She lit the small cast-iron stove, the dry pine catching with a cheerful cracking hiss that filled the room with a safe, comforting warmth. The children sat near the fire, playing with Simple wooden toys James had carved for them, their faces peaceful. Sarah stood, by the window, watching the gray light fade into a white, swirling darkness as the wind began to rise from the north, its low moan growing into a steady, deafening roar. The storm descended with a staggering vertical weight, the pressure of the pressure, Canadian cold front pushing the temperature down to 20 below zero in a matter of hours. From the safety of the cabin, Sarah watched the snow begin to swirl around the young evergreens, their branches already heavy with white. The wind screamed through the treetops, a high, wild sound that filled the cabin with a constant, deep-throated vibration. But the log walls remained solid, and the drafts that had once scoured the floorboards, were strangely absent. The air inside held its warmth with a quiet, steady ease. The blizzard struck with the full, untamed fury of the plains. For 3 days, the storm was a solid, screaming force that obliterated the horizon, turning the Hersen world into a churning chaos of white. The wind reached 50 miles per hour, carrying temperature drops that plunged the air to 35 below zero. It was a storm designed to find every weakness, to freeze livestock where they stood, and to reduce human shelter to cold, wet misery. But inside the circle of trees, the physical mechanics of Sarah's design were performing with extraordinary efficiency. As the howling gale struck the outer ring of ponderosa pines, the force of the wind was instantly broken. The trees did not resist. They combed. The millions of needles divided the solid blast into thousands of tiny, harmless currents that lost their momentum within the staggered branches. The wind, stripped of its velocity, dropped its burden of snow. This process created a massive, wind-carved crescent drift that built up steadily against the outer tree ring, rising in a graceful curve well above the cabin's roof line. This drift did not press against the cabin. It was held back by the trees, forming a solid, insulating wall that wrapped the courtyard in a place-forming, protective shield. Because snow has a natural insulation value of roughly R1 per inch, this 6-foot-deep drift became a massive R60 insulation blanket, preventing the sub-zero cold from ever reaching the cabin's immediate environment. Inside that sheltered circle, the air was almost perfectly still, and the cabin logs held their warmth with ease, requiring only a fraction of the wood Sarah's neighbors were burning just to survive. Sarah kept the stove burning at a low, steady rate, using only 3 or 4 logs at a time. In previous winters, she would have had to load the firebox every 2 hours, burning through their precious cordwood just to keep the room above freezing. But now, with the windbreak and the insulating snow wall blocking the cold, the heat stayed inside the logs. The interior air stayed at a comfortable, stable 58 degrees, and the children slept through the Bolensaum, night without waking. Sarah sat by the stove, listening to the muffled roar of the gale outside, and felt a deep, quiet sense of vindication. Her father's forest lessons had stood the test of the Dakota winter. On the morning of the 4th day, Sarah awoke to a silence that felt absolute. The roaring monster of the wind was gone, replaced by a quiet so profound it pressed against her ears like a heavy weight. A soft, clean light filtered through the top of the cabin window, suggesting the return of the sun. Her heart hammered with anticipation as she pulled on her heavy coat and boots, ready to face the verdict of the storm. She lifted the heavy wooden bar from the door, expecting the solid resistance of a drifted-in entrance. She pushed, her muscles tensing, but the door swung open, easily, sliding over only a few inches of soft, powdery snow. Sarah stepped across the threshold and stopped, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes took in the scene before her. The space directly surrounding her cabin was completely clear. A perfect, quiet circle of still air lay between the log walls and the massive, sculpted rampart of snow that had built up against her trees. The snow wall rose in a graceful, wind-carved curve, its white surface sparkling like ground glass in the brilliant morning sun. Her young evergreens were half buried in the drift, their green tops poking through the snow like brave flags on a fortress wall. They had not been broken or crushed. They had been embraced by the storm, using the very snow that threatened them to build a perfect, insulating shield. The air in the courtyard was quiet, almost warm compared to the biting cold she could feel just beyond the barrier, and her chimney drew clean and steady into the blue sky. The children emerged behind her, their eyes wide with wonder at the white wall surrounding their yard. To them, the courtyard felt like a secret playground, a magical, protected valley carved out of the winter wilderness. Billy threw a handful of light powder into the air, laughing as it drifted slowly back down in the still air. Sarah looked at her home, safe and dry inside its living riven fortress, and felt a profound, swelling sense of gratitude. The long, exhausting weeks of digging and hauling had paid for themselves in a single morning. It was 2 days before the deep drifts allowed any travel through the valley. Silas Thorne rode over on his horse, his face tight with the expectation of a tragedy. He had spent 3 days fighting the cold in his own home, burning through 3 weeks of his wood supply just to keep his drafty rooms above freezing, and he fully expected to find Sarah's cabin buried and dark. But as his horse struggled around the final drift, Silas stopped dead in his tracks. He saw the thin, steady trail of smoke rising from Sarah's chimney. He saw Billy and Lucy, dressed in their coats, building a small snowman in the clear courtyard by the door. He saw Sarah herself, calmly splitting dry cottonwood logs near her woodpile, her face peaceful. Silas dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the powder, and walked slowly into the quiet zone she had created. The transition was physical and immediate. The wind outside the tree ring was still a biting, freezing presence. But the moment Silas stepped past the snow-covered pines, the air went completely still. He pulled his thermometer from his coat pocket, his hands trembling slightly, and held it steady. Outside the circle, the temperature read 25 below zero. Inside the courtyard, protected from the wind, the air was nearly 20 degrees warmer. He followed Sarah into the cabin, where the small stove held a cozy 64 degrees on, only a handful of wood. Silas stared at the thermometer, then at Sarah, his traditional certainties shattered by the quiet proof of her intellect. Silas stood in the center of the kitchen, his heavy coat feeling suddenly too warm as the heat from the stove radiated through the room. He touched the log wall. It felt warm, dry, completely free of the damp frost that had coated his own walls for days. He looked at Sarah's woodpile, noting how little had been used compared to the massive depletion of his own stocks. It was an empirical, undeniable proof that her design was superior, a reality that his long years of frontier experience could no longer deny. He realized that she had not built a monument of twigs, but a highly sophisticated thermal engine that had kept her family safe while his own had nearly frozen. Silas Thorne stood at Sarah's kitchen table, his gloved hands holding the warm mug of coffee she had poured for him. He looked down at the dark liquid, then up at her, the hard lines of judgment on his face softening into an expression of profound, quiet surrender. He admitted he had been wrong, his voice low, gravelly in the warm room, and asked if she would show him where to harvest the saplings when the spring melt arrived. This simple, honest request was the quiet victory Sarah had been waiting for. It was not a triumph of pride, but of truth, a silent validation of her intellect and her father's legacy that offered a deep, healing closure after the long 2 months of her grief. Soon, others in the valley followed Silas's lead. They had heard the story of the Fortress of the Plains, and they wanted to understand how 100 small twigs had outperformed the thickest walls in the territory. Sarah shared her father's principles with everyone, explaining the mechanics of windbreak density, and the thermal value of still air with patience and clarity. By the following autumn, small circles of green began to appear around other cabins in the valley, a signature of a new, quiet wisdom taking root in the hard Dakota soil. The Vance shelter belt became a local legend, a living monument to a woman who chose to understand the wind rather than fight it. The young evergreens around Sarah's own cabin grew stronger with the years, their roots digging deep into the plains, their branches interlocking to form an impenetrable wall of green. Billy and Lucy grew up in their safe shelter, playing in the calm, protected courtyard their mother's hands and mind had built. They learned the names of the trees as other children learned prayers, understanding that survival was never a matter of brute force, but of letting the land protect you. The log cabin stood for another 70 years, and the trees stood longer, a dense, dark green circle on the wide prairie. A living monument to the woman who had listened to the wind, and in doing so, had taught the storm itself to build her a home.